Yay for a working webcam. Alright, so now we can get back to The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley. Chapter 18, The Fall of Verkini. As Miles was lifted from the ground by an unknown force behind, which had seized him beneath the armpits, his Roy opponents fell back away from him in surprise, but immediately their expressions changed to intense pleasure. Quite evidently they regarded this mysterious new power as an ally. Miles could not squirm around to see what was holding him, so still grasping his sword in his right hand, he felt with his left hand under the right armpit and found there the claw of a Formian. In another moment he would be within reach of its horrid jaws, and then would come the paralyzing bite which he knew so well from past experience. Nevertheless, he could die fighting. Shifting his sword quickly so that he held it point upward, he struck backward with it across his shoulder, and had the satisfaction of hearing and feeling it glint on the carapace of his captor. A few more strokes, and by lucky chance his blade might find a joint in the back shell of the ant-man. But just as he was about to strike again, a familiar voice behind him called out, "Stop, Miles! For the builder's sake, stop! It is Doggo who holds you, and is rescuing you from your enemies." It was the voice of Quiven. Tippy and the Roys instantly understood and made a rush at their late victim, but they were too late, for Doggo had lifted the Earthman safely over the wall. There stood Quiven and the members of the guard. "Quick, Doggo, the rifles!" Miles shouted. "Your missing plane is in the next enclosure. We must reach it before the enemy does." But, of course, this was all lost on the radio sense of the Formian. The other members of the party acted at once. On their side of the wall there was a platform near the top. Springing lightly onto this, the furry maid and the captain of the guard covered the Roys with their rifles. "You!" exclaimed Tippy in surprise. "What did you expect?" Quiven taunted. "You attacked this city in search of me. Here I am. You can have me if you ever catch me. But you had better not try it just now, for I and my friends have these magic slingshots which will kill at almost any distance. Go quickly before I try it on you. For old time's sake, I'll let you go." But Tippy and his Roy stood steadfast. The captain and Quiven fired. 2 Roys dropped, and then the others fled precipitately out through the gates by which they had entered. Tippy the steadfast was left alone confronting Kabod and his companions, but he never budged. Over the fence vaulted the 5 Verkini guardsmen in their leather armor and attacked the renegade countryman, who, being a noble, wore only a leather helmet. The unequal contest could have had but one result, yet Quiven looked on complacently at the impending downfall of her former sweetheart. Kabod, however, had more heart. Running along the platform within the wall, he vaulted over at a point distant from the contest, sneaked steadily up on Tippy, and then suddenly throttled him from behind, at the same time shouting to his own henchmen to desist. The 5 Verkings obediently dropped their swords, and then trussed up the young noble with his own leather belt and a sword sling by placing him in the sitting posture, tying his ankles together, slipping a piece of stick between his knees, placing his elbows under the ends of the stick, and then tying his wrists together in front of his shins. Also they gagged him, and thus they left the traitor rolled ignominiously into a corner, his eyes blazing with piteous hate. Meanwhile, Doggo, exploring the exits, had seen his plane. He returned to the group, bristling with excitement, and made signs to them to follow him. Out of respect for his joy, none of the party let on that Kabot had been the first to find the airship, and had already informed them of it, so they followed Doggo, and gave every indication of being much impressed. With loving touch and the huge black ant-man caressed each strut and brace, and the guy and the joint, the lever, as he made a thorough inspection of his long-lost craft. All appeared to be in perfect condition. Even the bombs, the rifle, the ammunition, all were intact. From somewhere in the interior of the fuselage, Doggo produced a pad of paper and a Formian stylus, and wrote, "Alcohol. We must have alcohol. Then away from these accursed shores forever." Seizing the writing materials, Miles replied, "You have 4 rifles. Let me take one of them. Protect this plane and the other 3 while I return along the back way and bring alcohol here under convoy of the entire laboratory guard." Then, giving no time for dissent, he seized the rifle and bandolier from the plane and was gone. Out through the next enclosure he went, slid open the secret door in the wall, and peered cautiously out. One lone ant-man with his rifle and bandolier was parading the alley. Miles fired, but missed. The Formian promptly took cover behind a pile of rubbish and fired back. Miles hastily withdrew, then cautiously put his head through an opening again in order to try to take a shot at his enemy. But the enemy fired first, and the bullet grazed the leather helmet of the Earthman and stunned him considerably. So he sat on the ground within the enclosure and rubbed his sword head for a few minutes. What a narrow escape! Then he had an idea. He propped his hat on a stick so it would sway gently in the breeze, its rim just projecting the opening in the wall, giving every indication of life. He then ran quickly along the inside of the wall until he came to a corner which he judged must be opposite the rubbish heap which sheltered the Formian. Climbing quickly up and studying at this point, he peered carefully over. There lay his black ant-man enemy, only a few feet away, steadily watching the bobbing edge of the helmet. 2 shots from Kabat's rifle and the vigil was over, and soon the Earthman and his helmet regained, and with the extra rifle and cartridge belt flung across his shoulders was proceeding unmolested down the alleyway. He reached the laboratory without further adventure and found everything as he had left it. The guard, however, reported that they had had to repulse 3 assaults by the Roys, the last of which had been led by a Formian armed with a rifle. "If it had not been for this magic slingshot which you left with us," said the guardsman, "we should have been beaten. But the surprise of the savage ones at finding us thus armed was so great that even their leader could not rally them, though the beast did kill several of our men before he finally fled with his Roy henchmen." The radio man then informed them of his intention to cart the alcohol to Judd's enclosure, where new wonders would be performed. Accordingly, all except a few sentinels withdrew into the laboratory to load up. First Miles sorted out the bottles, which were small enough to carry conveniently, and then filled those bottles with alcohol from the large carboys in which it was still stored. This left a dozen or so carboys still unemptied. It'd be a pity to leave these behind, but it would be impossible to get a cart out by the back way. So the radio man gave hasty directions to take an empty cart through the front gate under his guard and attempt to get it around by various winding streets into the alley without its being captured by the enemy. Meanwhile, all the alcohol was moved to the alley gate and heavily guarded there. While this was being done, Miles Cabot took a few minutes' time for a farewell glance around his laboratory, which he was about to quit for the last time. He had enjoyed working here, for there is no human pleasure greater than the joy of accomplishment, and here he had accomplished that almost superhuman task of building up a complete sending and receiving radio out of its most basic elements. Even though he was at last about to journey home to his Lilla and his baby son in Cupia, he hated to leave his precious set. An irresistible impulse drew him to it, and as the lodestone draws a magnet, he placed his fingers on the controls. He tuned into the same wavelength in which he had talked and received earlier in the day. A voice was speaking in the language of Formia and Cupia. "Verkingi is about to follow, master, and with it the Minorian must certainly get into our hands, for our scout flyers are circling the outer walls of the city to prevent his escape." So that's why the ant planes hadn't bothered them recently. "But, oh, master," the voice of the ant-man continued, "I have bad news reporting along with the good, for while practically our entire populace is engaged in the hordes of our ally, the Terrible is besieging Verkingi, other hordes of furry savages under this Grod the Silent have attacked and captured our own city of Urania, and with it have seized our reserve planes and supplies of ammunition. I have," but before the Formian could complete his signing off, Miles slammed the leaf switch and cut in with, "Kabat speaking, Kabat speaking. Know then, O Yuri, that Verkingi will not fall. My arms are victorious here at your aunt city of Urania. Presently you will cease to receive any further messages from either here or your own mountain station, and you will know the last of the Formians has been perished off the face of this continent. Soon you may expect me and my furry allies to fly across the boiling seas to redeem Cupia, but of our coming we shall give you no further warning. Tremble and await us. Meanwhile, believe none of the stories which your henchmen have falsely been sending you, trying to keep up your courage. Answer me now and tell me you've received the message. I have spoken." Then he let the switches to receive. Back came an answer, but it was from the mountain station in the south, and it came from Prince Yuri and Cupia. "It's a lie! The Minorian lies!" Of course it was a lie, but it was war, and Yuri would not know which version to credit. If anything should happen to the sending set near the city of the ants, Yuri certainly would believe the worst from that time on. Cabot smiled to himself. The Formian continued denying and explaining and apologizing. Finally he signed off, and then Prince Yuri got on the air. "Listen, O Formian," he said, "and you, O Kabat. I received both your messages. Naturally, I believe my own man. Call me again when you have something further to report. I have spoken." "He may believe his own henchman now," Kabat muttered to himself, "but later he'll begin to doubt." Then, shutting off his set, he penned a hurried note, in duplicate, to Otto the Bold. "Congratulations on the capture of the city of the Black Beasts. Destroy their hut in the mountains, where you first shot arrows at me, and first saw me use the magic slingshot. Destroy it at all costs, for with it ends the power of the Black Ant Beasts." Kabat the Minorian. One copy he gave to each of the two most trusted of his laboratory guards, and adjured them with all costs that they must break through the lines separately and get the message to the prince of the friendly faction of Roys. "If either of my Verkings succeeds in reaching Prince Otto," Miles said to himself, "it'll mean the end of Yuri's reports from this continent." Then, with a sigh, the radio man picked up an iron mallet and demolished his own radio set, the work of so many hours of care, which, when he had finally finished, there was not a fragment left intact. "This too must pass," he quoted sadly. At this point, one of the Verkings rushed in upon him with a shout. "A party of Roys is attacking the alley gate!" Shaking himself together, the radio man bade farewell to his beloved laboratory, picked up his 2 rifles and his ammunition, and hastened to take command of his forces. He found that his cart had safely gotten around to the gate, but that a hand-to-hand conflict for its possession was now in progress between the guard and a large force of Roys. So intermingled were the contestants that the leader of the Verkings had not dared to use his rifle. Kabat, however, had the confidence of greater experience. A few well-placed shots fired by him from the gate, and the enemy broke away and retreated down the alley. Miles handed out one of his own 2 rifles, thus raising the number of his riflemen to 2. These, with several bowmen, took a cover down the alley to hold off any counterattacks by the enemy. The carboys of alcohol were then quickly loaded into the cart, along with all the reserve ammunition which Doggo had manufactured, and the expedition set forth. Kabat with his rifle in the lead, and the other 2 riflemen and the archers forming a rear guard, closely followed by a hostile band of Roys. But in spite of the pursuit, all went well until the party turned into the alley to the secret door to Judd's enclosure. Here they found the way blocked by a formidable body of furry savages, led by half a dozen ant-men armed with rifles. Luckily, there was plenty of rubbish in the alley, behind which to take cover from those ahead. Those behind were not much of a problem, not having any firearms other than bows and arrows. But it was aggravating to be stopped within sight of one's goal. Furthermore, 3 of the rifle-armed ants promptly departed, doubtless for the purpose of either bringing up reinforcements or of joining the Roys who were on the other side of Kabat's party. There was no time to be lost. The rifles were now 3 to 3. Accordingly, the Earthman called his archers from the rear in order to charge. Of course, his porters could not fight while carrying a bottle of alcohol under each arm, so all the bottles were piled around the cart and left with a small guard. The attack proved temporarily successful. Step by step, the 3 ants and their Roy allies were driven back. But just as Kabat and his Verkings were about to gain the secret opening in the wall, word was brought that the Roys in the rear were attacking the cart. So Kabat had to order a speedy retreat in order to save his precious alcohol, thus giving up, in an instant, all the ground which had taken so long to gain. The Roys were readily repulsed from the cart and retreated down the alley in disorder, but the party with whom Kabat and his Verkings had just been fighting formed at once for a counterattack. At this juncture, a row of heads suddenly and unexpectedly appeared over the top of the wall. Quiven, the Golden Flame, Doggo, the Ant-Man, and 6 Verking guardsmen. Quiven and 2 guardsmen held rifles with which they promptly covered the approaches to the alley, while Doggo started hurling airplane bombs into a group of Roys led by his own 3 countrymen. When the smoke cleared, the alley was cleared as well. Here and there were arms and legs and other anatomical sections of Roys and Formians. All the survivors had fled. Miles picked up 2 ant rifles and twisted remains of a third, and then hurriedly passed what was left of the precious liquid fuel in through the little gate in the wall. Nearly half the bottles and carboys had been broken during the fighting. The Verking dead numbered about a dozen, and several more were wounded. These were brought within the enclosure and ministered to by Quiven. By this time, the pink twilight had begun to settle over the planet Poros. Departure this day was now out of the question. Accordingly, the guards were posted, and the rest of the party prepared to spend the night close to the plain, on tapestries filched from the palace of Judd, the excuse-maker. The radio man himself was nearly exhausted, having worked steadily for 36 hours on the completion of his set and the subsequent fighting. Yet before he turned in, he inquired about the state of the battle. It appeared that little was known, save that the city was overrun by ant-men and furry savages of Act the Terrible, and that isolated groups of Verkings were defending as best they could in their respective enclosures against the invaders. Cabot reported the capture of the ant city by Grodd the Silent, which news served to hearten his own little band considerably. The mention of a radio set, whereby he had obtained his information, suggested to him to ask, "Have you yet tried to get the palace of Theof the Grim, with the small set in Judd's quarters?" "Yes," Quiven replied, "repeatedly, but no one answers. You see, the palace set is in my own rooms, and it has probably not occurred to anyone to go there." Then they lay down for a fitful night of shouts and shots and flares, but no one attacked the enclosure which they occupied. Along toward morning, the Earthman fell into a soundless sleep, only to be awakened by one of his Verking soldiers shaking him roughly by the shoulders. "Awake!" the leather-clad warrior shouted. "Awake! Verkingi is in flames! The fire is rapidly eating its way toward us!" It was true. All around them was the uncanny red of the conflagration. Overhead were sped flocks of the sparks against a background of billowy clouds of smoke and a further background of jet-black sky. Immediate steps would be necessary to protect their airship from the flying embers. Accordingly, the bottles and carboys of alcohol were emptied into the fuel tank of the craft, and then filled with water. Brooms of brush were brought and used to beat out as many sparks as endangered the plane. Doggo tested the motors and found them in good order. The tapestries were loaded on board. Then there remained nothing they could do except keep watch, guard the plane, and await the dawn. Although, of course, if the Holocaust should approach too near, it would be necessary for them to fly, night or no night. Meanwhile, it occurred to Miles to try once more to get the palace on the air. So with rifle and ammunition slung over his shoulders and carrying a torch, he proceeded to Judd's quarters. On the way, he spied a dark form crouching in the corner of the fence of one of the enclosures.